Hello everyone. Today's video tells the story of Jim Harper, a carpenter who worked for 35 years and is facing the decision of retirement. After retiring, Jim decides to make room for Danny Carter, a young man struggling to find stable work. With Jim's help, Danny and his family overcame their difficulties and stabilized their lives. Danny thanked Jim with a picnic, and in the end, Jim received an unexpected gift from an old acquaintance. Jim's decision to retire changed Danny's life and left a positive legacy for the entire community. Let's begin the story together. The sun hung low over Brutus, Michigan, on a humid August afternoon in 2018, its golden rays filtering through the dusty windows of Jim Harper's weathered pickup truck. The engine growled as he navigated the gravel-strewn streets of the small town, the familiar crunch of tires, a steady pulse beneath his thoughts. At 62, Jim was a carpenter whose life had been carved from wood and nails. His broad shoulders bore the weight of decades spent framing houses, barns, and the local library, while his hands, rough with calluses and scars, told stories of hammers swung and beams hoisted. His graying hair poked out from under a faded baseball cap, and his blue eyes, once sharp with purpose, now flickered with a quiet uncertainty. Retirement loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, a decision he'd wrestled with for months, torn between the comfort of rest and the rhythm of work that had defined him for 35 years. Jim pulled into the driveway of his modest ranch house on Maple Lane, the truck's door creaking as he stepped out, his boots scuffing the cracked pavement. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint tang of sawdust from a neighbor's shed, a scent that clung to him like a second skin. Inside, the kitchen was warm with the aroma of Ellen's chicken noodle soup, a recipe she'd perfected over their 40 years together. Ellen Harper, a gentle woman with silver hair tied loosely at her nape, stood at the stove, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon. Her hands, nimble from years of tending her garden, moved with a quiet grace as she glanced at Jim, his broad frame slumping into a chair at the oak table they'd built together decades ago. "Union called again today," Jim said, his voice gruff as he rubbed the back of his neck, easing the ache from a long day. "They're pushing me to file the papers. Say I've earned it, pension's ready." Ellen turned, wiping her hands on her faded apron, her brown eyes soft but firm. "You have, Jim. 35 years swinging that hammer, you've built half of Brutus. It's time to let those hands rest." He stared at the table, tracing a scratch with his thumb, a mark from when he'd taught Ellen to carve a spoon, back when their laughter filled this room more often. "Don't know what I'd do without the work," he admitted, his tone heavy. "Feels like I'd be quitting on myself. On us." Ellen set a steaming bowl in front of him, the broth swirling with carrots and herbs. "You're not quitting," she said, sitting across from him. "You're choosing something new. We could fish, fix up the porch, maybe travel. See that lake house in Traverse City you always talk about." Jim spooned the soup, the warmth seeping into his bones, but his mind churned. The union had been relentless. Phone calls, letters, even a visit from old Tom Grady, the rep who'd known him since his apprentice days. "You've paid your dues, Harper," Tom had said, clapping his shoulder. "Let the young bucks take over." Jim had nodded, but the words stuck like splinters. He wasn't ready to fade into the quiet. Not yet. The next morning, August 28th, Jim drove to Hank's Hardware for a box of screws, the bell above the door jingling as he stepped into the cool, cluttered store. Shelves brimmed with tools and bolts, the air thick with the metallic tang of oil and wood shavings. He was reaching for a pack when a voice cut through the hum of the shop, tentative, rough with strain. "Mr. Harper, that you?" Jim turned, squinting against the light streaming through the window, and saw Danny Carter, a wiry man in his early 30s, his sandy hair mussed and his green eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Danny had worked under Jim 5 years back, a quick study with a knack for framing, until a wave of layoffs swept him off the crew. "Danny," Jim said, a grin breaking through his weathered face. "Hell, it's been a while, kid." "Yeah," Danny replied, clutching a small bag of nails, his smile thin and fleeting. "Too long, I guess." His jacket hung loose, frayed at the cuffs, and his boots were scuffed beyond repair. A stark contrast to the eager worker Jim remembered. They stepped outside, the August heat pressing down as they leaned against Jim's truck. Jim lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the still air. "How you holding up?" he asked, exhaling a slow plume. Danny kicked at the gravel, his shoulders slumping. "Not good, Jim. Been out of work over a year. Odd jobs mostly, but nothing steady. Got a wife, Lisa, and 3 kids now. Tommy's 6, Grace is 4, little Ben's just turned 1. Bills are stacking up, and Lisa's pulling double shifts at the diner. Union's got nothing, and I'm lost." Jim's chest tightened, the cigarette burning low between his fingers. He saw the old Danny in flashes, the kid who'd climb scaffolds with a laugh, who'd talk about building a home for his family someday. "That's a rough patch," Jim said, voice low. "Anything I can do?" "Just keep me in mind," Danny said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'd take any gig, anything to keep us afloat." Jim nodded, clapping Danny's shoulder, a gesture from their sight days. "I'll see what I can dig up," he said, though his mind was already spinning beyond promises. That night, Jim sat on his sagging porch swing, Ellen watering her marigolds nearby, the crickets chirping a steady lullaby. Danny's words gnawed at him. 3 kids, a wife, no work. Jim and Ellen had no children, their life a quiet duet of shared meals and small joys, their savings solid from years of careful living. He could grind out another year, maybe 2. But Danny's family couldn't wait. The union needed workers, good ones, and Danny was that. By midnight, Jim's decision hardened like oak. He'd quit, not for himself, but to hand Danny a lifeline. August 29th broke with a clear sky, and Jim drove to the union office, a squat brick building humming with the clack of typewriters and the murmur of tired voices. Mary Klein, the clerk with a quick wit and a no-nonsense stare, looked up as he approached her desk. "Jim Harper," she said, smirking. "Finally throwing in the towel?" "Yeah," Jim said, sliding his resignation papers across the scratched counter. "I'm out." Mary raised an eyebrow, pen poised. "Thought you'd die on a scaffold. What flipped the switch?" "Got a replacement," Jim said, leaning in, his voice steady. "Danny Carter. Worked with me years ago. Good hands, better heart. He's got a family to feed, been out too long. Put his name down." Mary scribbled a note, her smirk softening. "Carter, huh? Crews are short. I'll push it up the chain. Might just stick." Jim tipped his cap, the weight of his tool belt lifting as he stepped into the sunlight. He didn't tell Danny. Not yet. Let the kid feel the surprise, he thought, driving home past fields ripe with corn. Ellen met him at the door, her gaze sharp. "You did it," she said, a quiet certainty in her tone. "For Danny," Jim replied, pulling her close. "He's got more to build than I do." The September sun cast a mellow glow over Brutus, Michigan, in 2018, its light filtering through the cracked windows of Danny Carter's cramped rental on Pine Lane. The air outside carried the crisp bite of early fall, leaves just beginning to turn gold along the edges of the small town's streets. Inside, Danny stood in his cluttered kitchen, a wiry 32-year-old whose sandy hair was thinning from months of worry, his green eyes flickering with a spark they hadn't held in over a year. His wife, Lisa, a petite woman with dark curls tied back and a diner apron slung over a chair, poured coffee into a chipped mug, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. Their 3 children, Tommy, a scrappy 6-year-old with his father's eyes, Grace, a quiet 4-year-old with pigtails, and Ben, a babbling 1-year-old in a high chair, filled the room with a chaotic symphony of laughter and clinking spoons against cereal bowls. Danny leaned against the counter, his voice low but edged with disbelief. "Union called this morning. Got a job. Full-time with Harper's old crew. Start tomorrow on Route 9 framing a school." Lisa's mug hit the counter with a soft thud, her brown eyes widening as she turned to him. "You're serious? After all this time?" "Dead serious," Danny said, a grin breaking across his tired face. "Jim Harper quit. Gave him my name as his replacement. I'm in." Lisa crossed the room in 2 steps, throwing her arms around him, her apron catching on his belt as she buried her face in his chest. "Jim? That gruff old goat? I can't believe he'd do that." "Believe it," Danny said, holding her tight, his voice thick. We're gonna make it, Lise. Finally. Tommy looked up from his cereal, milk dripping from his chin. Does this mean we can fix my bike, Dad? Soon, champ! Danny laughed, ruffling his son's hair. Grace tugged his sleeve, her voice small. And my bunny's ear? Danny nodded, scooping her up. That too, Gracie. The first day on the job dawned cool and clear, September 3rd, 2018. Danny pulled on his old work boots, scuffed but still solid, and drove to the site, a sprawling skeleton of beams and concrete on Route 9. The crew chief, a burly man named Pete Sullivan with a gray beard and a no-nonsense squint, handed him a hard hat. Harper vouched for you, Pete said, sizing him up. Said you're steady, don't prove him wrong. I won't, Danny replied, his hands itching for the hammer he'd pawned months ago. Pete tossed him a new one, union issue, and Danny set to work, the rhythm of nails sinking into wood waking a part of him he'd thought lost. The crew moved fast, but Danny kept pace, his muscles remembering Jim's lessons. Measure twice, cut once, trust your swing. By noon, Pete clapped his shoulder. Good start, Carter. You'll do. The first paycheck came 2 weeks later, a lifeline after months of ramen, pawned gear, and Lisa's diner tips stretched to breaking. Danny paid the overdue rent, dodging the landlord's glare, and stocked the fridge with chicken, milk, and apples. Real food, not scraps. He bought Lisa a new pair of sneakers. Her old ones had holes from endless shifts, and picked up a toy truck for Tommy, a doll dress for Grace, and a teething ring for Ben. The rental, a drafty 2-bedroom with peeling paint and a leaky sink, began to feel less like a prison. Lisa cut her hours at the diner, her shoulders lifting as the constant scramble eased, and Danny came home each night with sawdust in his hair and a smile on his face. One chilly October evening, Danny drove to Maple Lane, his truck rattling past Jim's house. He'd heard Jim was fishing at the lake, but Ellen was in the yard, tending her zinnias under the fading light. She looked up as Danny stepped out, his tool belt slung over his shoulder, a small paper bag in hand. Mrs. Harper, he said, tipping his cap. Danny Carter. Jim gave me his spot. I've been working steady since September. Wanted to say thanks. Ellen brushed dirt from her hands, her smile warm and knowing. He's a softy under all that growl. Said you were a good worker, family man. I'm glad it's working out. More than that, Danny said, handing her the bag, a potted marigold, Lisa's idea. For you, tell Jim we're grateful. He saved us. Ellen took it, her eyes crinkling. He'll mutter about it, but he'll love this. Thank you, Danny. Danny drove off, the marigold a bright spot on Ellen's porch. Jim saw it that night, grunting, no need for fuss, as a grin betrayed his pride. He didn't chase thanks. He saw it in the lights staying on at Danny's place, the kids' chatter drifting through the crisp air, the steady hum of a family pulling through. Years rolled forward, Brutus weathering its seasons with quiet resilience. By 2020, Danny's crew finished the school, a sturdy brick building that echoed with kids' voices, and Pete bumped him to assistant foreman, a raise that padded their savings. Lisa quit the diner in 2021, turning her baking into a small market stall, her oatmeal cookies a local hit. Tommy joined Scouts, Grace took dance lessons, and Ben started daycare, his toddling steps a marker of time. In 2022, they bought a fixer-upper on Cedar Drive, 3 bedrooms, a patchy yard, a chance to build their own. Danny patched the roof himself, Jim's old tricks in every shingle, his hands steady with purpose. One rainy afternoon in April 2023, Danny ran into Sally Brooks, a diner waitress who'd worked with Lisa, over coffee at the Rusty Spoon. Sally, a wiry woman with a quick laugh, slid into his booth. Heard you're climbing, Carter, she said, stirring cream into her cup. Foreman now, huh? Jim Harper's doing? Started with him, Danny said, grinning. Quit to give me a shot. Best thing that ever happened to us. Sally nodded, her eyes warm. He's out fishing, living easy. You're carrying his torch. Danny carried that home, sharing it with Lisa over spaghetti. Jim didn't just give me work, he said, twirling his fork. He gave us a life. We owe him more than flowers. Lisa squeezed his hand, her curls bouncing. Let's show him, really show him. The kids could help. The idea took root, a quiet plan simmering as Brutus rolled into 2024, 6 years since Jim's choice lit a spark Danny hadn't dared dream of, a spark waiting to flare into something bigger. The summer sun blazed over Brutus, Michigan, on July 15, 2024, its heat shimmering off the still waters of Lakeview Pond, where Jim Harper stood casting his fishing line from a weathered dock. At 68, his once broad shoulders had softened with age. His hands, scarred from decades of carpentry, moved with a deliberate slowness, guided more by habit than haste. His gray hair, thinning under his faded cap, caught the breeze, and his blue eyes squinted against the glare, a quiet contentment settling into their depths. 6 years had passed since he'd quit his job at the union, handing his spot to Danny Carter, a choice he rarely mentioned, though Ellen, his wife of 40 years, saw the pride in his rare, fleeting smiles. Beside him, Ellen sat on a folding chair, her silver hair glinting as she knitted a blanket. Her garden back home a riot of roses and daisies thriving in the warm months. Brutus hummed around them, its streets lined with homes Jim had framed, its rhythm a testament to his unseen hand. On Cedar Drive, half the mile away, Danny Carter tightened the last screw on a wooden picnic table he'd built in his yard, sweat beading on his brow as he stepped back to admire it. At 38, his sandy hair was streaked with early gray, his green eyes bright with a steadiness earned through 6 years of hard-won stability. His kids, Tommy, now a lanky 12-year-old with a scout badge pinned proudly to his shirt, Grace, a thoughtful 10-year-old with her mother's dark curls, and Ben, a wiry 7-year-old with boundless energy, tested the table, their laughter ringing through the patchy grass. Lisa, Danny's wife, adjusted a tray of lemonade on the porch, her baking business, Lisa's sweet stop, booming with summer orders for cookies and pies. Their fixer-upper home, bought in 2022, stood proud with fresh paint and a new roof, every inch a testament to the life Jim's sacrifice had made possible. That morning, Danny had found an old union pay stub in a drawer, dated September 2018, his first week back, stamped with Jim's faded signature as a reference. The sight hit him like a hammer to the chest. 6 years ago, Jim had quit, not for himself, but for Danny. A stranger then, a desperate father with no way out. Now, here they were, a house, a family, a future. "We've got to thank him right," Danny said to Lisa, wiping his hands on a rag. "Not just words, something real." Lisa nodded, setting out a batch of oatmeal cookies, Grace's favorite recipe. "The kids can help," she said, her curls bouncing. "Make it a family thing." By noon, the Carters loaded their SUV with a picnic spread, ham sandwiches, lemonade, Lisa's cookies, and a wooden sign Ben had helped carve. Harper's Rest Stop, etched with a crude hammer drawing. They drove to Lakeview Pond, the kids buzzing with excitement as the gravel crunched under their tires. Jim and Ellen looked up as the vehicle rolled in, dust swirling in the summer air. "Jim, Ellen!" Danny called, stepping out with a grin, his family spilling from the car behind him. "Got a little surprise for you." Jim reeled in his line, his eyebrow arching as he set his rod down. "Carter? What's all this?" 6 years, Danny said, gesturing to his kids as they unloaded the picnic. "Since you quit for me. Wanted to say it proper, show you what it meant." Tommy and Grace carried the sign to Ellen, its wobbly letters glowing in the sunlight. "For your doc," Tommy said, puffing out his chest. Ben hauled a small folding chair, a thrift store find they'd painted blue, setting it beside Jim. "So you can sit better," he chirped, and Jim's gruff facade cracked, a low chuckle rumbling out. Ellen took the sign, her eyes misting as she traced the carving. "Oh, this is wonderful," she said, nudging Jim. "Look at what they've done." "No need for this fuss," Jim muttered, but his mouth twitched upward as Lisa handed him a cookie, still warm from the oven. "There's every need," Danny said, spreading a blanket on the grass. "You gave me work, saved us. We've got a home now, kids in school, Lisa's baking for half the town, all 'cause you stepped back." Lisa sat beside Ellen, her voice soft. "We were sinking. Rent late, fridge empty. You quitting? That pulled us up when we had nothing left. The kids dragged Ellen to the chair, insisting she test it, while Danny set out the picnic under a sprawling oak. They ate in the shade, the lake lapping gently, stories flowing like the breeze. Danny's first day framing, Lisa's first market sale, Tommy's scout camp, Grace's dance recital, Ben's soccer tryouts. Jim listened, quieter than usual, his hand resting on Ellen's knee as the weight of 6 years settled over him. Ellen squeezed his fingers, whispering, "You did this, Jim. Look at them." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Danny's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped aside, answering with a frown. "Yeah? Carter," came Hank Grayson's gravelly voice, the construction boss who'd hired Danny's crew for years. "You with Harper?" "Yeah," Danny said, glancing at Jim. "We're at the lake." "Put him on," Hank barked. Danny handed the phone to Jim, who took it with a scowl. "Grayson," Jim said, his tone clipped. "What's this?" "Harper," Hank boomed, his laugh crackling through. "Your boy Carter's a damn fine man. Foreman now, best crew I've got. Heard you quit to give him that shot 6 years back. Paid off big. Got a project, a rec center for Brutus. Need a consultant, part-time, good pay. You in?" Jim froze, the line humming in his ear. "Me? I'm out, Hank, retired." "Bull," Hank said. "You built this town. Know it better than anyone. Carter vouched for you. Says you're the guy. Few days a week, easy cash, what do you say?" Jim glanced at Danny, the kids, the signs swaying by the dock. "Days later, huh?" he muttered, then louder. "All right, Hank, I'm in." He hung up, shaking his head as Danny grinned wide. "Boss called," Jim said, handing the phone back. "You set this up?" "Nope," Danny said, clapping his shoulder. "You did, 6 years ago. Just took a while to come back around." The Carters packed up as dusk fell, leaving the chair and sign, gifts for Jim's new chapter. Ellen hung the sign that night, its letters glowing above the kitchen sink. Days later, Jim met Hank at the site, his hands tracing blueprints again, his quiet legacy growing. Word spread through Brutus. Hank bragged to the crew, Lisa's customers spread it at the market, and small acts bloomed. A farmer fixed a neighbor's fence, a teacher tutored for free. Danny mentored a rookie, passing Jim's wisdom. By fall, the rec center's frame rose, Jim's name a whisper in its beams, a job quit, a family saved, a town reshaped, all from one man's choice.